how to just minimize, like, as brutally as possible, as quickly as possible, minimize those feedback loops so that people can iterate and kind of get to the thing that they really, truly, genuinely want to build.
Hey team, Sid here, and this is DevOps Deployed, the show where I take a look at DevOps and cloud infrastructure in the wild. Each week, I interview industry experts about their experience building software systems and the teams behind them. Today, I'm joined by Jake Cooper. Jake is the founder and CEO of Railway, a cloud platform as a service designed to let people focus on building their products instead of wrangling infrastructure. Word on the street is that he also has a pet bearded dragon named Irwin. Jake, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. All of that is true. I do have a bearded dragon. His name is Irwin. He's very, very great. He's like perfect pet you could ask for because he's a great reading buddy. You just basically kind of like post him up and then he's there. And yeah, we do help people just like wrangle, the heck out of their infrastructure. So yeah, that's me. I'm just excited to be on the show, just kind of like jam on infrastructure stuff, and just generally it's Friday, right? So it's a good time anyways.
It is indeed. And so for anyone who's not familiar with your company, Railway, can you just give a brief overview of what it is and how it helps people in the software space?
Yeah. So Railway is the cloud that kind of like helps you get stuff done, right? And so generally, like most people's association when they think of cloud is like the AWSs, the GCPs, the kind of et ceteras of the world, where you go in and you're kind of like clicking around these menus. You have to write, potentially like CloudFormation or Terraform scripts or anything like that. They're generally like quite heavyweight, and they're like a very, very powerful saber wielded by professionals. And so there's just this growing gap of like engineers entering the scene, and just a lack of people who have all of the infrastructure knowledge required to kind of navigate AWS and GCP. And so what we've done is we've made it insanely easy to use any of these cloud platforms, right? So instead of setting up like VPCs for Postgres and CloudFormation or Terraform scripts and kind of everything required to actually go and run these things, we have a series of kind of best practices that we've distilled into these cookbooks, where you can simply just go to kind of dev.new and then you just write into existence whatever you would like, right? And so you just start writing Postgres, right? And that would hook into kind of a universal memo that we have for how we would roll out a Postgres instance, right? And after that, that instance is up and running as quick as you can kind of get it, and you can go and make modifications, et cetera. So the ideal here is that we can take all of the config and kind of like push it post haste, so you can get something up and running really, really extremely quickly, as well as kind of like dive into the config when you really need. It's a constant battle between kind of like convention versus configuration, and our solution is that your configuration is actually our convention.
Interesting. And a lot of people are probably familiar with other platform as a service offerings, maybe Heroku or App Engine. Can you, just to provide a frame of reference, maybe compare and contrast what Railway provides and how you approach things to some of those other services that people may be familiar with?
Totally. And so a lot of people are familiar with the kind of like Heroku's, the renders, the Cloud Runs, the kind of et cetera of the world. And we like to like mention that these things are kind of like single dimension, right? And the dimension they operate in is actually just kind of the production dimension, right? And so they're kind of like existing there, and once you get your application up and running, it's up and running, right? But they generally don't offer you tools for kind of like evolving your application over time, right? And so Railway aims to actually make it really, really easy for you to evolve your infrastructure over time. And so in that sense, people look at our platform initially and say, like, how is this different from Heroku? How is this different than Render? How is this different than anything else? When in reality, we compete, like, I like to say that we compete with not these cloud providers, but actually the closer to kind of Terraform with IntelliSense on top of it, right? And so you can essentially espouse these changes, we'll kind of distill them, and then we can move them through your application lifecycle. So it's a lifecycle management engine versus a standard kind of like cloud production environment.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And later on in the interview, we'll talk a bit about what's going on behind the scenes and how you actually do that. But first, let's talk about some of the different elements of that experience. So as you're helping users deploy this infrastructure and manage this infrastructure, there's a number of different phases of the life cycle, whether it's developing or deploying or monitoring and diagnosing any issues you might have. Can you talk us through those different pieces and how they all fit together?
Yeah, totally. And so we think of development as kind of like three concrete steps, and it's cyclic, right? And so you touched on them, and we talk about them a lot in our kind of documentation, our content, or anything like that. We've got the develop step, which is kind of like you're iterating, you're starting. You pick a starter, and you're like, cool, I'm going to build a Next.js app with Prisma and a couple other things. I'm going to tie those in. There's the deploy stage, which is like, how do you get your application from your local instance to the cloud. And then there's the diagnose stage, which is monitoring, alerting, metrics, kind of crash notifications, right? And these, again, they're super cyclic, right? So as your role changes out, you'll see, some sort of crash notification, some sort of memory leak, some sort of anything like that. And then we can actually help you evolve that application over time by providing feedback and saying, oh, here's the error that actually crashed your application. We can actually restart it, but we're notifying you of this error, and you can kind of evolve your application over time and make that loop as quick as possible. And that's what we tend to focus on a lot at Railway, is like how to just minimize, like as brutally as possible, as quickly as possible, minimize those feedback loops so that people can iterate and kind of get to the thing that they really, truly, genuinely want to build.
And I'd be interested in hearing the origin story of Railway. What led you to the point of creating it? It's about a year and a half or 2 years old now at this point.
Yeah. So we launched last January. So it's just over about like 13, 14 months and kind of like in production. We were working on it probably about 3 or 4 months before that, right? So let's just call it 18 months or something. I think it's actually pretty close to exactly 18 months. But yeah, before that, I was, constantly hacking on side projects. I was working on a bunch of other stuff. I was actually at Uber. And I was just like, I was fiddling on a few things, and I used to work on this platform called Jump, which, I'm just like a big fan of, like micromobility in general, and like getting cars off the road, and like, I could talk on and on about like city planning and kind of those things. So they're the things that they're like really important to me. And I just generally, think about emissions in the environment a lot, right? So I was working on this platform, and I really, really liked it. And then it kind of got to the point where Uber wasn't, they were going generally in a different direction, and so what happened is that division ended up getting shut down, right? And I personally, I don't own a car. I've never owned a car. I have a motorcycle and a boosted board, and those are the ways that I kind of like get around in general. And so I didn't see myself generally kind of like gravitating to continue to want to work there. So I basically said, what am I going to do next, right? And I was ideating on a couple of things. I was fiddling around, and there's all these really, really great tools for building front end applications. Like there's Vercel, right, which is just like it's pure magic. All of they do is pure magic. And so like I'm looking at these things, and I'm like, cool, like there's this glaring hole. Like how do I spin up a database? Like where can I get a database, right? And now when you talk about this, there's like things that are popping up like Supabase, et cetera. But this was kind of like the inception, the early 2020s, et cetera, right? When a lot of these things kind of popped out. And so I was just hacking a bunch of stuff, and I ended up like spinning up this VM, and writing this like crappy bash script. And I used to post this endpoint every single time that I wanted kind of a Postgres database, and it would just thunk out a URL, and I would just go and use that, right? And so I was ideating on a few different things, and
you were just installing multiple instances onto this VM? One VM, or were you spinning up?
I was honestly just like spinning up multiple containers, right?
Yeah,
and then it's just like, there's just like, oh, cool, it's on a port. Here's the port. Like, go and do the thing, right? And so I was like doing that, right? And I was like, okay, cool. Like, this will be great for like hacking and stuff like that. It's not really like, tenable, but that's okay because it's all just hacky stuff. And then I just kept iterating on that, and I was like, well, I need Redis, I need et cetera. So I kind of extended this thing, and then people started using it, and then I was like, I do want to go work on this. And I went to a variety of different people. Like I went to, people at GitHub, people at Vercel, people at, varieties of different places. And I'm like, you guys must be building these things, right? Like you must be building this kind of like all-in-one dev tool that like this kind of just generally trends towards. And to my surprise, they weren't. But a lot of these people were like, this seems really, really cool. And we can see it working. So by the end of this, I had a lot of no's from like, you can have a job, but like a lot of yeses from, I'd write you an angel check, right? So then we were like, all right, cool. Like, let's go do this. And so we started building up from there. And we shortly after recruited our first engineer, who's just like phenomenal. And every single person we brought on after that has just been like phenomenal.
The fact that you were just kind of scratching your own itch and then realizing that it seemed like a more broadly applicable solution is a pretty neat way to get started, I think.
Yeah, and we continue that like to this day. Everything we do is inside of Discord. Our community, our like enterprise support is inside of Discord. Our team stuff is inside of Discord. And so anytime there's an issue with a user or a company or anything like that, it's very simple to actually just like riff on it in the team chat and be like, oh, here, like this thing is actually totally problematic for some people, right? And it's a really good way to just like aggregate things across time. And so like we do a lot of scratching our own kind of itches. We dog food all of our stuff. We use Railway to kind of build Railway. And so, yeah.
Cool. And clearly it is well suited for like N-tier long-lived web apps. That's like the canonical example, right? Are there other workloads that you have seen customers use Railway for, or are there any things that customers have done with the platform that really surprise you? They took it and just kind of ran in a direction you didn't expect.
Yeah, I'm constantly just like surprised, right? And so like our original version of Railway was like this really, really simple kind of like, okay, well, you've got a bunch of plugins, you can add Redis, you can have MySQL, you can have whatever, and then you can actually just deploy some arbitrary code, right? And you can deploy like one of them, and we were just going to do like blue runes deploys, you can deploy APIs, etc. And then people were like, hey, I need like worker queues, I need like celery stuff, I need like, I want to deploy like temporal on this thing, right? And we were like, oh man, like this really doesn't work because like we were having people like spin up multiple projects and then like interface them, and then there was like no shared like networking or like whatever, so it just like ended up being a little bit chaotic. And then so we just like spent a really really long time trying to think about like how you would actually just make it really really simple to deploy like a service mesh,
Mm-hmm.
but also keep the level of simplicity that you had from for prior applications, right? And so we released that probably about a month ago, and it's been really, really awesome. People have just picked it up. Like we had a company reach out for, there's those companies that do kind of like on like it's like in your own cloud deployment kind of deal.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, they're using AWS and this, and then they kind of like reached out and they're like, hey, like we'd like to like migrate off of this because we just like we have people that are on the team who aren't infrastructure engineers and they're pulling away from the infrastructure engineers because they need to page out to AWS. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Like I'll schedule some time for tomorrow. I can help you onboard. And my usual thing is like when we do onboarding, I like sit down with the company and I like try and basically build their infrastructure with them over the 30-minute period. And by the time I had answered the emails, like I went back and checked their like Teams thing, and they had already moved over like a bunch of their production infrastructure. Were using like custom icons that we had just rolled out. So I'm just like constantly surprised by the amount of stuff that people are like kind of like pushing on here, and then they keep asking for stuff. So it's really great feedback loop in terms of product stuff. And I feel like we, sometimes we're cheating because we just get really, really good feedback from these people, and we're like, oh yeah, we should just go build that, right?
Right. And who are your core customers in terms of, are there any particular industries you've seen a lot of use from, or size of a company? I'm sure it varies quite a bit, but are there any insights from that you've drawn from the set of customers that you have?
Yeah. And so there's a lot of different use cases, obviously. But what we see a lot of is kind of like this greenfield, like early stage startups, like whether they're YC companies, whether they're kind of like indie hackers, whether they're kind of like, just teams that really, really want to move really extremely quickly on a lot of this stuff. And that can be anywhere from like pre-seed to like series B, C-ish startups, right? And that's kind of our sweet spot, right? Where we've got all these engineers, they really want to operationalize them. They don't want to sacrifice anybody, the AWS gods. And so they just kind of like need something that will like get them up and running really, really quickly. And so we've seen a lot of really, really great greenfield stuff there. As we kind of like move up market here, we're targeting more kind of what we call brownfield. So internal tools, connecting in with your infrastructure automatically so that people can just like pull in from varieties of data sources, but still ship extremely quickly using kind of like our control plane, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, in addition to the types of companies, you also have a unique audience in that your customer base are very technical, and generally are software engineers. What can you say about the uniqueness of really targeting a technical audience like that as your primary user, relative to maybe other companies that have a more broad consumer appeal?
Yeah. And again, this is one way that I feel like we're cheating because developers are like one of the most vocal people like I've ever encountered. Like they are not shy to just like tell you like why your product stinks, why like these things are, right? So we get a lot of this like feedback from these people, and they are as devoted on both ends of the scale, right? So they will tell you like what they really like absolutely hate, and then they'll tell you like what they absolutely love, right? So you get a lot of like really strong signal from these people, right? Which I think is really awesome. And like, as we build to the, product that we want, and we're getting more kind of like dashboard hours, more people involved, more kind of like interest, et cetera. It really helps to like have these developers who are extremely bought in and like very, very interested, right? Like our Discord community is growing every day. It's like almost up to like 3,000 people that we've got inside of there where they're kind of like helping each other out. They're being like, oh, cool. Like I'm running into this issue with the build packs. And they're like, oh yeah, actually that's over here and stuff like that. Right. So it's just really awesome to have people who like really care about the product, and they will tell you when things are broken, right? We have automated integration tests that run in prod every single 5 minutes. And sometimes we'll push a change and then one of the users will basically be like, hey, this is messed up. And you're like, wow, you literally just beat our like, random like second order integration tests like off the block, right? So yeah, it's pretty funny. They're very, very awesome users. So I couldn't imagine building for another set of people.
Yeah, that's got to be rewarding to get that immediate feedback from the end users and be able to incorporate that into the product. I'd love to shift gears a little bit and peel back the curtain um, on Railway and talk a bit about what's going on behind the scenes to make all this happen. So you've really distilled down this development and deployment experience to streamline it for the end user. And so now let's chat through kind of what it takes to make that happen. So can we just start by maybe giving a high level overview of what your infrastructure stack looks like? Probably a smorgasbord of tools and systems, but we can start there and then maybe dive into some more specifics once we lay that out.
Yeah, totally. And like I'll start on like the most kind of like front end side, and we can move our way through the infrastructure stuff, which I think we'll spend the majority of our kind of time on this. But on the front end, we have kind of like a TypeScript React code base that we just serve, and we've got an automated kind of generated GraphQL client that hooks in with I think it's GraphQL Nexus, which allows us to do like deny by default, really, really awesome, fully typed kind of like end to end into our backend API design. Everything is kind of like onion routed. So we have like handlers, controllers, gateways inside of that. And that TypeScript service is essentially like our edge router for the dashboard, right? And then anytime we need to actually access any of the internal infrastructure, like the orchestrator, like the container provisioning engine, the routing engine, the proxy, kind of any of those things, those are all gRPC Go microservices. And so those are just kind of generated and they land on our infrastructure via a combination of Terraform and Ansible. And then Temporal actually manages the container lifecycle management engine. And so it will call out to these varying different microservices. And you essentially just write workflows. And Temporal is just phenomenal software. It's awesome. It powers like a lot of stuff at Uber. I was going to say most, and it's probably apt, but it powers a lot of stuff at that company. And it's just like very, very just great to just like work with. And so yes, it manages like our container lifecycle engine. So what happens when a user kind of like goes to dev.new and hits Postgres, we take that kind of desired state and then we go and create a workflow, which actually goes into the infrastructure and projects that desired state and figures out where to actually land this container. And based on a variety of kind of factors, whether it's like stateful, whether it's has like scaling metrics in the past that we can use to discern like how we're going to auto scale this thing. Those get pushed through the router and figured out where to land onto this like mesh of what we call stackers, which are basically just Go binaries that have access to virtualization hardware or virtualization software like Containerd, or we're looking at like Firecracker or stuff like that. But basically the ability to kind of do like container lifecycle management on a singular host, right? Yeah, so that covers most like the kind of broad strokes of that, and I'm happy to like dive into anything that you might find interesting, intriguing, etc.
Yeah, I think that helps quite a bit. And yeah, I think the piece that I am most interested in is the back half of that, sort of what happens when a user goes on to, as you were saying, the is it dev.new? Dev.new.
Yep.
And is rolling out some deployment for the first time. It sounds like that sequence of events creates a declarative state of some set of containers, whether that's their application plus some set of other peripheral services, Postgres, etc. And then
yep,
that is, you use Temporal to actually go off and provision all that.
Yeah, so it is exactly, it's like, well, I was going to say it's exactly that, but it's like mostly that because it's not as declarative as we would like it, right? And so Cube and a lot of other kind of orchestrators, they offer this really, really awesome, thing where you're just like super declarative and it kind of goes, right? And we've kind of, built an orchestrator from scratch to actually manage a lot of the like stateful workloads and deal with a lot of the kind of issues surrounding that. And so it's a very, very imperative process that we're moving towards a more kind of declarative cycle for. But again, like Temporal does manage that life cycle. So anytime that those things are spun up or crashed or need to be reseeded or anything like that, those are things that we go and do through the orchestrator built on top.
Got it. Yeah, I haven't worked with Temporal directly, so I'm less familiar there. But from your description, I think I have a relatively clear picture of what's going on.
Yeah.
Cool. And then in terms of this is all transparent to the end user, but presumably you are not managing your own data centers. this is all getting deployed onto a public cloud, or is that an incorrect assumption?
No, so what we do is we actually deploy it onto, for simplicity, just like VMs
Okay.
on top of GCP. And so we basically target, like we make it so that it's targetable for quote unquote bare metal, right? And so we don't use any sort of like baseline Google primitives or anything like that. We just have this kind of like single cloud just for simplicity in terms of managing this infrastructure, but it does run on top of these kind of machines, and we actually do the orchestration, containerization, et cetera, all in kind of like code that we roll out on our level, right? So we don't hook into like Cloud Run or any of these underlying primitives because they are slightly different across clouds. And our long term vision is actually to kind of provide this single pane of glass that allows you to define your infrastructure and expropriate it to kind of any sort of like location, right? So our ideal is to actually be able to move all of these things like cross cloud, cross whatever. If you have kind of data centers that you are going in and wanting to run, like our goal is to build the consumer grade software that will allow you to run on commodity based hardware with the level of reliability and kind of like sophistication you would get on kind of like the spending many millions of dollars to like spin up your own infrastructure, right? And in that sense, we can actually bring a lot more powerful or a lot more power back to these companies versus like AWS and GCP just charging an arm and leg because you have just massive vendor lock-in.
Yeah, and I think that leads me to my next question, and I may know the answer, but I'll ask it anyways. Are you spinning up a new VM for each customer and then orchestrating within the context of that VM, or is there some concept of multi-tenancy within those VMs that you're managing?
Yeah, so there is a concept of multi-tenancy within those VMs, and so you're landing different workloads on top of these VMs depending on this kind of constraint function that we have on top of it. Yeah.
And so, uh, as a customer, do all of my corresponding workloads end up within one of these systems, or is the system set up such that it doesn't really matter and the orchestrator can place them wherever there's space, and then the networking is all set up accordingly?
Yes. Yeah, right. So that's exactly it, right? Like, it's designed so that you can land it on any sort of piece of hardware. And so our ideal here and what we use internally is just this Go binary that we call the stacker. And that lands and it hooks in with the routing engine, as well as temporal, and basically says like, I exist on this kind of plane of existence. Here's how I can potentially be reached. I have compute, I have memory, I have storage, and I have virtualization hardware. And it just emits these stats back to the cluster, and it kind of, basically creates this vector that we use when we do the routing and provisioning, and that says like, where should I be landing these, right? And we can actually just arbitrarily extend this to, just add another kind of property to this vector and say like, oh, actually, like if we're landing stuff for like quote unquote on-prem, it actually needs to land on this series of VMs using this key pairing, right? And so that's how we extend it is in a way that it's supposed to be completely VM, completely like cloud, completely whatever agnostic, so long as you have this binary that you can kind of run on this hardware, and has access to sufficient virtualization to provide this level of security that we require, then you can just like
Got
land
it.
code
And
onto it.
the initial decision to go with temporal plus this custom orchestrator on top of it versus something like Kubernetes, can you talk me through that decision process and the motivations for going this route?
Yeah, totally. So there's a couple different things, but mostly it comes down to like scaling stateful workloads. And so that's the big kind of like problem with a lot of these things, right? So let's say you seed a database with 4 gigs of RAM, and since all of our things are like single tenant isolated instances for security reasons, we need to be able to actually dynamically scale these instances up and down, right? And if you want to do that on Kube, you're going to have to potentially reseat this workload. And if it's a stateful service that you can't actually guarantee, like the ability to clone this data around and shard it effectively, then you're hosed and you actually give the customer kind of downtime, which is why people are just generally like, don't run Kube on like, or don't run databases on top of Kube, right? And so what we did is we built this orchestrator to allow us to actually grow these kind of stateful workloads more elastically on top of the VMs, right? So they can actually take precedence over any sort of stateless workloads, right? And we use the kind of stateless workloads to kind of like pad these things, right? And so you can think of it a lot like, if you had a jar with a big rock in it, and then you had a bunch of sand in it, right? Like that's kind of like what we're working on, right, at the VM orchestration level. Kube's got a lot of great stuff that's kind of coming down the pipe. There's ways to do virtual kubelets. There's ways to like specify your own scheduler. I have like I would say like a solid understanding of it, but I'm definitely not kind of like a very extremely seasoned infrastructure person, right? And so we brought in a couple lovely people who are like working on the orchestration stuff that I've built, as well as having a look at potentially what it looks like moving forward, right? But our be all end all kind of goal is actually to make it so that this is just completely cloud agnostic, works for kind of like stateful as an extension of stateless workloads, and just makes it really, really trivial to just kind of land these things anywhere.
Yeah, I think that point you bring up about uh, the difference between stateful and stateless workloads, and the fact that many examples or use cases gloss over that difference and just start using stateless web apps and everything works magically out of the box. But actually, under the hood, it can be much more challenging once you bring in the concept of needing to store and move and back up data that needs to persist across restarts, across months, across years.
Yeah, right.
I think that's a really
it's a slow kind
point.
of battle of like teasing out a lot of these things and making sure that we can like give people the level of like reliability and fault tolerance and stuff like that we like genuinely would want of like an industry standard orchestrator. But there is a lot of kind of like stuff that we've built from scratch, right? And so this is kind of the situation that we are in right now, where we're building out a lot of these things, and we're also having a look at potentially how we would move to a more standard orchestrator. But like I said, with this is kind of like a implementation detail. Whatever kind of guarantees the experience that we want is awesome, right? And then the other thing is in terms of like speed and placing these workloads. If you go to dev.new and you kind of go command K, that all happens in real time, right? And for us, the real time like element is really, really important. And any sort of like time dilation you have in between like modifying these instances and actually like seeding those workloads, it really matters, because you're operating like you have to kind of create a game server if you were to do it the other way, versus if you can do it all in real time, then you can actually operate on that data with like just slight like CRDT style like roll out, roll back, like rejecting of the updates, right? So
Yeah, and I think I saw on your site that you support both container-based workloads via Dockerfile or build
yep.
packs. Uh, are there any interesting challenges there in supporting both of those
Oh
options?
my God, yes. So the build packs are they're a great effort in doing something that is extremely complicated, which is essentially trying to distill magic, right? And so when you do package JSON detection, you do all of these things. It is like there's an amount of kind of like implicit overhead that each one of these changes has, and so it compounds really heavily. So what happens is that the build packs they end up breaking sometime, right? And so we have to pin some of these, and we have to manage them, and we have to like backfill for specific use cases, right? Like people are like, oh, how do I add Rust? How do I add whatever, right? And our default answer is like, oh, write a Docker file. But like, at the end of the day, we're trying to make this approachable as kind of for everybody, right? And a Docker file, like, unfortunately, isn't the most approachable way to do this. And so we've like noodle on a bunch of things. We've like talked with the people over at Fly.io. We've both kind of like been experimenting with like some Nix-based stuff. I know the Replit people are also experimenting with Nix-based stuff. The challenge isn't really in kind of like doing the actual orchestration with this, because everything just goes to like an OCI compliant image. The challenge is more actually like, how do you give people a really, really good reproducible experience that like is fast, right? And I know like, pretty much everybody in this industry seems to be working on this stuff, right? Like Vercel's working on monorepo caching. They just picked up Turbo Repo. Like the caching is like such a mammoth thing. And I think Nix OS really has an opportunity to actually make this like phenomenal, right? And I suspect that a lot of people are going to actually move over, right? And just define a lot of your stuff as kind of like a Nix config, and then distill it to an OCI compliant image, and then go and orchestrate that.
You're building a platform that others are building their products and companies on top of. And so with that comes expectations of uptime and SLAs
Yep.
and high reliability. Are there any interesting stories you can share over this time you've been operating Railway around dealing with that and managing expectations and fighting fires? I'm sure they've come up along the way, that you're able to share.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of kind of operational overhead that comes in running a cloud with like 7 people, right? And at the end of the day, we're like an extremely small team running like extremely lean, and we support like 40,000 users. We've got like 600 and something paying customers, and like, 40 kind of full on teams like shipping daily, et cetera. And they're working across like anywhere from like a 5 person to a 20+ person team, right? And so there is that level of like, you know, you have to have things that work, and you have to have redundancy in place, and you have to have all of these things that work, right? And so it's honestly like, if we need things that are like, our serving layer needs to be kind of bulletproof, there needs to be replicas kind of everywhere there, right? But beyond those things that are kind of like standard that you would kind of just generally think about, there's constantly things that are just like like they're outscaling the implementations that we have, and generally stuff that I've kind of like built and like pulled more people in. So we've had to rebuild the routing layer, we've had to rebuild like the logging layer, we've had to rebuild the kind of like, we're in the process of like rebuilding the stacking layer, potentially look at the orchestration. It's just this constant battle of like, how can you build tooling that you really think is going to like carry for a year, get that into place as quickly as possible without causing any sort of outage, make sure that you like do zero downtime rollouts for any sort of your migration stuff. So I can't really pick like a specific thing, because it is genuinely like every month or something like that. It's like, well, like, we're seeing a little bit of sagging in terms of like Envoy's time to live. And then we're like working with the Envoy people, and we're like, oh, like actually like, there's this weird nuance with like stats that's actually causing like our deployments to like spike in internal back pressure in Envoy. And so it's genuinely one of the like coolest spaces ever, because like I can't think of any sort of problems that I'd want to work on that aren't in this, right? Like there's compute problems, there's network problems, there's routing problems, there's orchestration problems, there's build and deploy problems, there's like compiler level adjacent problems for like dependency management. There's like DAG management for like how you're going to do like blue-green rollouts across like your service mesh. And so it's just like one of the coolest, most fun things that I could think to work on. And I just like, I'm going to be spending the next like decade of my life here. And I suspect that, I won't scratch the surface on a lot of these things, but that's just kind of how it goes down. So.
Yeah, I think that story of building it to support your current workloads plus maybe the next 10x, but definitely not scaling to 100x, or else you'd probably be wasting time and money trying to prematurely optimize for those cases. So I think that approach of kind of dancing from what is the current bottleneck and alleviating that bottleneck to allow you to keep going and keep scaling certainly sounds like the right approach. Yeah. And it's a similar story to what I've seen working with other startups.
Yeah. And I think a lot of organizations, they approach this from an engineering problem, but I think it's really like an operationalizing or an ops problem, if that makes sense. And so we do a lot of things, like we do admin-based rollouts. We have this thing called priority boarding, which is like a feature flagging engine built on top of Discord. So we can say like, we're rolling this out. If you want access to this feature, we'll add this role inside of Discord. That will get propagated to our internal like feature flagging engine, and then those will kind of go into your accounts, right? And so we can pull in a lot of telemetry, right? And I know we're going to talk about it in a bit, but there's a lot of things you can do from like a life cycle of a feature beyond actually kind of like designing and shipping the feature that really play extremely well into this, right? And how you decide like which features to keep, how you decide which features to roll out, how you decide success criteria and reliability criteria, and kind of all of those things, right? So it's much beyond engineering, but it's like really, really fun. So
I think that's a perfect segue into the next section of the discussion around the team at Railway and operational aspects. You mentioned there's 7 of you currently. So there's probably not too much structure within that, but what's the breakdown? Are pretty much everyone technical, or are there some non-technical folks? Is there management and IC levels, et cetera? How's it laid out?
Yeah. So the org chart is kind of fun because it's like completely inverted, if that makes sense. And so we just kind of have like the people who are shipping things, and then the overflow of the stuff that they can't ship, like just generally falls on me. And then I go and like take that and then go to still like a hiring pipeline for it. Right. And so as it stands right now, we're 7 people, 6 engineers, 1 product designer. He used to be in like mechanical engineering design, so he used to design boxes, so he's like right kind of there with us. So it's a very, very kind of like technical focused kind of crew, and we're slowly kind of like bringing in more people. We have our first marketing hire that will start in a couple of weeks. She's going to really help us with a lot of our kind of language and branding, and she was like, you have a lot of really great stuff here, but you're not doing a great job operationalizing a lot of it. And I was like, that's why we're having this conversation. It's awesome. Right. And so there's not really any sort of like management overhead. I do personal one-on-ones with the team. It's mainly to like feel supported and see how I can actually like backfill those roles there. Yeah, so there's basically just kind of like a what do you need like sent like delegated, etc. How is that going to work? And I just kind of provide this like soft layer of like management and kind of like that, right? And as it scales, we will ideally have to add some sort of layer, but I think we're really like focused on a lot of like optimization processes. Like I think that the best thing that you can do when you're a small team is like really figure out like where your kind of like big hires need to be and then really just like automate every single thing else, right?
Yeah, and you published an article called How We Work that kind of outlines a number of your principles around how the team at Railway works, focused
Yep.
on minimization of meetings, doing avoiding stand-ups and doing what you're calling daily wraps instead. Can you walk me through some of the key elements of that work process at Railway and how you think about that?
Yeah. So I've been doing remote work since maybe 2015. I used to work at like Wolfram when I was in college. And they had this like really great culture of like async most things, very few meetings, like getting stuff done and just like being very open and honest and kind of just like emitting the things that you're doing out into the world because everybody across worked across time zones. Like there were periods in which I worked like from my college town, Vancouver Island. There were periods where I was working out of like Amsterdam and Italy and stuff like that. And the process didn't really like generally change on a lot of those things. And then I moved to a couple like more centralized companies with like more stand-up-y kind of things. And I generally just like I always felt that there was this kind of period where people would slog into the office and they would all kind of like show up for stand up and people wouldn't be so super awake. And then you'd want to like respond to something, but there wasn't essentially like enough oxygen in the room to basically necessitate a really good conversation about this, right? And so when we started the company, it was basically like, it was COVID times, right? So there was basically no reason to like actually go and have an office. There was no reason to like be in person. Our founding engineer was out of London. And so we just basically kind of like came to this conclusion of a lot of things that like really help us out, right? And so we don't do a kind of like daily stand up. What we do is a daily wrap, which is basically like every 24-hour cadence, you add like what you worked on either like the prior day or the following day, depending on like where you kind of like fit in that loop. And then we also do we do two synchronous meetings a week, a Monday kickoff and a Friday wrap. And that's generally just to like jam on things and like, kick off the week and kind of like close out the week and like provide a little denouement period for like shipping stuff on Fridays. We do a lot of like hyper optimized stuff inside of Discord. Like I mentioned, our community is in there. We have like bot ops for any of like the community members to basically flag us with layers of like escalation, being like, oh, I can't actually help this person with this. Probably need a team member for that. We have incident management inside of Discord. So you can do like !incident and it will go to like the Discord emission channel and propagate to anybody who subscribed to this, as well as like updates on our in status. We have engineering design review like queues where you can basically say like, review this thing and it's inside of Notion. You go and you have a look at it, comment, move it through kind of the lifecycle management. We have hiring queues now inside of Discord, which are like managed, and we're optimizing that. So very much on the kind of like async as much as possible, automate as much as possible, and see how much leverage you can add to your team, right? And I've chatted with a few kind of ex-founders, and a few things that they kind of harped on is like it would have been really nice if we did this. Is that when they hit their kind of like scale stride and then people were pushing them to hire, they really wish they had put some sort of like brutalist systematization in place. Like if you're going to hire sales engineers, you're going to hire salespeople, you should hire a salesperson and an engineer to go and automate all of the stuff that kind of like falls in their tailwind, right? And figure out how that actually scales and make it super tenable to like have engineering and sales work together and have engineering and marketing work together, right? And I think we're just like a very engineering first company, sometimes to a fault. And like these are just things that we have done that I think are just like allowed us to scale to like this many users with like this few people on like an infrastructure platform with like I don't want to say like amazing high availability. It's not Amazon yet, but it's like people are generally like quite satisfied with this and the response rates and kind of like making sure that their stuff is like in good hands. So
yeah, I mean the number of things that you have shipped with a team of 7 is pretty incredible. Like there's I think 40 plus different starter app like repos that you can use to put together different stacks, and there's like I don't know, there's just a lot of things there. So it's impressive what you all have built in the last year and a half.
And like cards on the table. Like we want to lean on the community a lot. We want to be like the community cloud. We want to allow people to actually extend this thing in a way that's like really, really awesome and possible. Because like, you know, you look at Amazon, and they basically just like they go after these products and they spin out these verticals and they spin out these managed services and they scale them, right? And they have this army of people and money that they can throw at it, right? And our goal is essentially to take the people who are actually doing all of that work, the open source maintainers, and long term, we would love to create a kind of like closed ecosystem to allow them to monetize a lot of their open source work, right? So authoring onto the platform, having these companies consume this, we can do their dependency management, and then we can actually do attestation to say, oh, you're running this software from these people, you're paying us $5,000 a month to like go and do this. We go and kick back $2,500 for that, right? And then that allows it to actually put the power into the hands of like the people who are building these things, right? So, you know, when you say that we've got like 40 plus starters, like I think we've shipped maybe like 8, 10 of them or something like that. A lot of them are just kind of from the community, and you can slap a button on any repo and it just kind of gets picked up. So
Yeah, I think that's an interesting approach of like democratizing the monetization of open source, or like giving more agency to open source projects to monetize directly. That I don't know that really exists currently with any cloud providers. So that's an interesting
yeah.
model. I also saw some documentation around how you approach engineering requirement docs. Can you talk a little bit about what those are and when they are appropriate and when they are not, in terms of writing them for a new feature that may or may not make it into the Railway platform?
Yeah. And so this is probably like, I know I talked a lot about systematization and stuff like that, but it's not a like check all these boxes kind of deal. It's like we put up these tools so that there's something you can reach for as you move through the life cycle of something that you're shipping, right? And so you can think of it a lot like a conveyor belt, right? Like you can just like start moving things through this thing, right? And maybe you'll like stack a couple of things on an ERD, right? And somebody can have a look at it, right? Maybe somebody won't necessarily be able to have a look at it by the time it goes out the door because like they were just kind of like genuinely working on it, right? There are obviously things that are more critical where you're like, hey, listen, I really just kind of need to stop the train here and like, sorry, no pun intended. But like go and kind of like move that through there, right? But you can think of it as conveyor belts, right? So they're just kind of like constructs you can attach stuff onto, right? And so at the start of it, it's kind of just like a Discord message that says like, hey, it'd be really cool if we had this feature, right? Like whether it's from a user, whether it's from us, whether it's from something like that, right? Just like someone to get the riff kind of going, right? And then it potentially comes into an ERD, which just basically has some background. Maybe they kind of link to the thread inside of Discord, you know, requirements, etc. And these are not long, right? Like there may be like 1 or 2 viewports worth of like implementation, unless they're kind of like large, like proxy, orchestrator, kind of like all of those things that are constantly evolving. And so you just kind of like spew out those things that you want, and then you start working and kind of moving this through the pipeline, right? And then there's plenty of section like periods to kind of evolve that application, right? Like if it doesn't necessarily fit the exact design document, you can just go back and update the design document, right? Like there's no kind of like watermarks for a lot of these things. They're basically just like guidelines for the tools that you can reach for when you kind of like want to go and do those things, right? And so sometimes you'll get an ERD with like so little content that you're like, yeah, we probably could have not, but like it's better safe than sorry. So like continue through there, right? Or you'll get a PR that's like, this could have been an ERD, but like, you know, it's up to the person, right? So at Railway, it's like a really high agency environment where it's like, you know, you generally kind of set the things that you need to like be successful and rope the people in that you need to be successful, right? A lot of it is ad hoc, a lot of it is async, a lot of it is like, you know, up to your best judgment, right? And so there's enough kind of agency there that you can kind of just like move through the entire pipe from the ideation all the way to kind of like the ship finished product that ends up in our changelog every week.
Got it. Yeah, I think that approach makes a lot of sense. And like, yeah, I've seen cases where teams add too much formality around design docs or engineering docs, and then others that don't use them enough. And so I think it's always trying to find that sweet spot where you're getting the value from them without overburdening the process. And it sounds like that is the balance that you're trying to strike there.
100%. I'm very, very like big advocate of like looser than necessary abstractions, even as just as like kind of an effort to kind of like go and rope in a little bit more, because a tight abstraction basically like it invites you to like actually circumvent it, right? And that basically means that you've picked the wrong abstraction, right? So it's better to like draw a looser abstraction around it and then actually like rope it in if you need to over time, versus like trying to define like strong pillars for a lot of these things, right? And we'll see how far that carries us, because obviously we're an early stage startup, and obviously at some point there will become like process that needs to get done, but I think that generally it suits us extremely well at this stage.
Yeah, I've worked with teams as small as yours and much larger. So I worked at Lockheed Martin at the beginning of my career, so we're 100,000 plus people, and then I've worked on startups that are just a handful of people. And so it is interesting, the sort of the natural breaking points where you, as you grow the team, obviously the number of potential connections between any two individuals explodes, and so figuring out where those natural inflection points are and how to handle them, I'm sure will be an interesting challenge over the next couple of years for you.
100%.
Cool. Well, as we wrap up, are there any sort of nuggets of advice that you would distill from your last 18 months building Railway and operating Railway, working with customers as they deploy applications on top of your infrastructure that you can share with others who maybe are trying to build out the DevOps function or cloud infrastructure systems within their companies?
Yeah. It always has to be easier than you think it does. Like it doesn't matter what the level of experience is, unless it is a purely a button and ideally just like something that you could hook into somebody's brain to read their mind. Like that's the level of kind of simplicity that you should strive for, right? If there is any sort of activation energy required in terms of like, YAML file, make a commit, like any sort of these things, like I often think in terms of like thermodynamics, any function you add to this thing is a lossy function. You will lose some amount of entropy as it goes through this pipe, and it is usually a lot more than you think it is. So that would be it. It's like keep it super simple and move fast, right? Move deliberately, but be safe. And obviously that's kind of like a counter example, but just do the thing. If it can be done really quickly and you want to get feedback on it, just like ship it.
Awesome. With that, I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much, Jake, for coming on. If people are interested
Cool.
in Railway,
Thanks
where should we send them?
Go straight to dev.new and start typing into that command box, whatever you want to, kind of deploy, whether it's something from your GitHub, whether it's a database, whether it's a Redis instance, whether it's anything in between. You just go there and then kind of espouse into existence, right? I'm always available. My DMs are open at justjake on Twitter. I'm inside the Discord. I'm Jake at Railway.App. You can just message me anytime, and I'll kind of be around. Happy to help anybody through any of that.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks so much. Great discussion.
Thanks.